All right, so here we're going to start by going to the PowerPack connection vault. And we'll scroll down the categories until we come to Purlins. And from the Purlin section, we'll select the rectangular Purlin connection. In here, we have our main member. We'll start by selecting that. You can see at the bottom it says select your main member or your supporting object. Right click. Then it says to select the first Purlin. Right click. Come across and select your second Purlin, or if you don't have any, just right click. It's optional. And you'll notice that when you do that, you're going to get connections beside the objects. You have the option in here to save your values when you're done as part of your library, so you can very quickly and easily come back and utilize that connection. And you can come down to Purlin plates and change the plate layout. Here we have the Purlin gap, so you'll notice that these are no longer flush with one another. There's a little gap, and you can control that gap from here. What is the plate length overall? You can adjust that. So if I put, for example, 12 here, you'll see it stretches outwards, and you can change the distance that you want that to be. Your edge projection. So you can adjust that edge projection in here as well. So if you don't want it to be flush with the top, or you need to pull it down a bit, you can adjust that here accordingly. You'll see it's pushing that down. And if I put it back to 0, it pushes it back up. Okay, so it's right now flush against this edge, and you can move it up or down. The chamfer height. In here you have your chamfers for the height and width on the corners that you can adjust them there and set them to whatever you want. Your offset. So if you don't want it centered on the main member, you can push it to one side or the other, and the thickness of that plate. Once that's in place, you have options for first and second plate, which will take place if it's on either side of the beam. In this case, that's not the case. So we're just going to see that these are grayed out. And we're going to come down bolts and welds. You can adjust these bolts and welds here to whatever size you need to use. You have the option here to say this is a 325 or whatever the case may be, what your bolt grade, what your assembly is going to be. If you want the bolts to be inverted, you can do that as well. The first weld thickness. So you can have a weld here between the plate and the main member. What is the thickness? And for the second plate, what is the thickness? Because there's one on the other side as well. And you can say create only holes, in which case it'll generate no bolts, just the holes. If you create the bolts, you have your first bolt group, and you can determine how many bolts you want horizontally. So if I were to put one, you'll see it comes in with just the one horizontally. And if I created only one vertically, you'll see it comes in with just that one row of bolts vertically. The edge horizontal distance, you can adjust this to move it around. So if I were to put 3 here, for example, you'll see it moves it from the outer edge inwards to the first bolt, whatever distance you put in here. You then have what is your vertical distance, which is basically the same idea, and you can adjust the vertical distance from the top of the plate down. That's a little bit too much. You can see from the top of the plate down to the first set of bolt holes, it's adjusted accordingly. You then have what is the intermediate distance for the horizontal bolts. So in between those horizontal bolts, how far apart do you want them? And if I were to change that, you'll see the distance in between the set on each side increases or decreases accordingly. So it adjusts 2 bolts on the left and then the 2 bolts on the right and sets the distance between those. And then you have here intermediate vertical distance, same idea on each side. What is the vertical distance between those bolts? Then you have your second set of bolts. Now, right now, both sides were changing the same way simply because this box was checked, same as first group. You can independently set one side versus the other if you want to by unchecking that box and then just adjusting as needed. You then have your support plates. So if I come down into here and click on support plates, you'll see first support plate. And right now, because it's sitting on top, I'm not getting the option for that. I have my second support plate, same idea. The bolts and the welds for that support plate, first bolts and second bolts. Now we'll take a look at this in a minute, but all of this you can see is grayed out because we don't have support plates in here. Right. So let me close this, and we'll come over here and we'll do one that's on the side. I'll do the same thing again, rectangular purlin connection. Pick the main member, right click. Pick the first secondary member, right click. The second one is optional, and I don't have a second one, so I'm just going to right click here. And you'll see that I get, again, support plates on either side, and the ability to go through and adjust this as needed. So here's my plate layout. What is the gap? If I need one, what is the first plate? The first plate is bolted. You'll notice that if I go to second plate, it's grayed out because there is no purlin on the other side, so there is no second plate. Okay, so I'm controlling just the one side right now. I could have this welded, leave it like that, put it bolted. Then I have my plate layout again. First plate, I'm going to come down here, inside chamfer, outside chamfer. I have the height and width. So if I want, I can adjust the little cut in the back and the cut in the front. Okay, so I have a chamfer on each side. What is the thickness of those plates? And do I want to project the edges? So you can see I can adjust down from the top or away from the web. If you want to adjust the plate length, you come here and it'll change the overall plate length. A second plate, again, grayed out, don't have one on the other side. Bolts and welds. What type of bolt do we want to use? You can adjust the size of those bolts, set them, say they're inverted, change the first weld thickness. So if you're using the weld in here, what is that weld thickness? And you can see the weld is being used here at the end of the plate. You can say create only holes, and you have then control over your bolts. And again here, second bolts, first bolts. And so what is the amount of bolts you want to use? If I put 1 and 1, okay, you'll notice it's affecting that side. So it's working on the plate on both sides of this object is side 1, or first set of bolts. Okay. So if I did 2 and 2 again, it brings those back. What is the edge horizontal? We'll increase this to 3. You'll see it moves it over from the edge of the plate inwards to the first set of bolt holes. Edge vertical distance, I'll put 3, and you can see it pushes it down from the top. So whatever distance you want that to be. You have your intermediate distance. You can adjust to whatever you need. And this is on the horizontal plane. And then you have it also on the vertical. So if you need to adjust it that way, you can. Second set of bolt holes, you can say same as the first, or uncheck it, but there is no second set of bolt holes here. It's not going to affect anything. Support plate. In here, if you need a plate underneath, you'll notice I have the option to create it here. It creates that plate underneath and puts one down here. I can have that bolted or welded, whichever I prefer. I can set the plate length again to the distance that I want it to be, and what is the edge projection. So if I need to change the edge projection, I can for 1 and 2, which basically, if I set that to, I'll give you an example, 3, it's pushing it outwards. It'll push it out on the other side as well. And what is the thickness of that plate? If you had a second support plate, which would be for the other side, you would be able to adjust that. Create one and adjust it. Your bolts and welds. I don't have bolts here now. If I turn them back on, now you can see I have options for the bolts and the welds. Okay. I put it back to welded. This becomes grayed out, but I still have my weld thickness here. Then you have, again, for your first bolt groups, very similar to what we saw before, the horizontal number, the vertical number, what is the edge distances, and so on. Right? And same for the second one. And this is all for the support plate, so you can go in and place bolts and adjust them there as needed. And that is the rectangular Purlin connection. And you can find that in the Graytech PowerPack connection book.